Hello, a warm welcome to everybody. This is Manoj Kulwal. I am your facilitator for this workshop, and this is the third session of the three series workshop we are having on the topic of best practices for assessing op risks and controls. While we have some participants still joining in, let me start by doing a quick summary of what we've covered on day one and day two. So far what we have covered is we've highlighted the challenges of the current risk assessment approaches, and some of the challenges we've covered is that most of the times those assessments are single point assessment rather than looking at the range of what may happen. Then we've also talked a lot about the data quality challenge that if the rules are not defined correctly, then the people who are entering those assessment responses may enter information which may not be very useful for them and for the people who are then utilizing the reports coming from that information. And also, most of the time, the risk assessment approach is also very qualitative, which makes it very difficult for the second and third line to do any sort of challenge if they're that qualitative. And then, of course, it also makes it very difficult when we want to utilize that information for any real life business decision making. So in terms of solutions, what we've seen so far is that we need to define the risks, first of all, at the right appropriate level of granularity so that they represent real risk of what first line is managing and not high level risk categories, which are most suitable for reporting to the risk committee. We need to document the risks in a consistent manner. So the risk register then is not a mishmash of risks and causes and impacts and control failures and process failures. We need to map the risks to the business objectives. So that's where we've looked at this concept of risk chain, because that's where first line does not care about the risk, they care about the business objectives. So if we can show the link between the risks and the business objectives, they will be a lot more interested in understanding and managing risk than if there was no connection between the risks and the objectives. Then we've looked at how can we address the single point assessment flaw we have in the current risk assessment approaches, where we looked at one method was to look at sort of the 4 range, where we created the minor, moderate, major, catastrophic. So we sort of at least look at from 1, we look at 4 ranges. We looked at another approach where we looked at the key drivers and how do you model them. And there was a data breach example we had covered. And we had also looked at the example yesterday with Mustafa on how do we use Monte Carlo simulations so that they can also be used to challenge any subjective assessments we may be doing and see whether if there is a big variance between what the Monte Carlo is saying and what your experts are saying, then you need to go and look at that, okay, who is correct and whether those assumptions behind those assessments, do we need to look at those a little bit more closer. So that sort of is the summary of what we have covered in the first 2 days. Let me just do this one thing and I'll be with you. Just wanted to close an app so it doesn't make too many noise in the background. Okay, so. Okay, all right. So that sort of is the summary of the first 2 days. So let's then look at some of the new sort of practices and ideas we can use to further improve the quality of our risk assessment. So the most important one is this one, the practice 5, where we need to find a way to integrate the management of the risk, and then in this case, also the assessment of the risk into the core business activities. So if there is a process owner in the first line who's responsible for designing and implementing a process, then the management of risk related to those processes should be part of the process management activity and not a separate activity. So we don't want the process owner to do one set of things for managing their process and then do very different set of things for managing their risk, because then we've created a disconnect. What we want to do is we want to find ways in which how risk and management of risk can be integrated in the process management activity. So it's not a separate activity. Similarly, if there is an owner of an asset, so if we talk about, let's say, an online banking system, that if the owner of that asset, then their job is to focus on operating and managing their assets, and managing the risks associated with their asset should be just part of asset management, of what they do to manage that asset on a day-to-day basis, and not a separate activity. Another example is a third-party relationship manager, that if they're focusing on maintaining smooth delivery of products and services provided by the third party, then again, the management of risk should be part of the third-party management they're doing on the day-to-day basis, and not a separate activity. And the same can be true for project manager, where managing risk should be just part of project management, that a project manager, if he's doing project management and then doing risk management separately, then we've created that disconnect, and then risk management will not be effective if those activities are separated. Yeah. So this is sort of one of the most important missing gaps, that in a lot of organization, risk has been created as something you then overlay on top of what you're doing on the day-to-day basis. And if that happens, then of course, you're never going to get buy-in from the first line from a risk management perspective. So how do we do that? So this is where I think from a second line perspective, we need to understand that, okay, what is the business trying to do? Because this is sort of my experience with working with a lot of clients, that second line does not fully appreciate what the first line is doing. And they just focus on, trying to enforce their processes and their methodologies on the first line. But if you don't understand what they're trying to do, then it'll always be difficult between the first and second line to try and work together and collaborate together. So what I wanted to highlight was look at some of the aspects of what is the first line trying to do in any organization, and then what do we want from a risk management perspective, and then how do we bring it together. So from a first line perspective, what every organization is trying to do is based on the business environment in which it is operating. It defines its business strategy. That strategy gets cascaded into different business objectives in terms of revenue and market share and profitability. Then every organization defines a risk appetite, so which risks we are willing to take or not take in order to achieve our business strategy and our strategic objectives. And then each organization is then making some strategic decisions around mergers and acquisition, opening new operations in new countries, and so on. And there are also a lot of strategic change management programs which may be running at the strategic level. So that is what is happening at the strategy level. Then the strategy needs to get implemented from an operational perspective. So what is happening at the operational level is that we're trying to provide our products and business services through the different channels. And the channels then can be branch banking, it can be online banking, it can be mobile banking, it could be through the financial intermediaries. So through the different channels, you're trying to reach out to the outside world. That's where your stakeholders come in. And in this case, customer would be those stakeholders who are then receiving those products and services through the different channels. But in order to deliver those products and services, we need to then have business processes in the organization, and we need assets. So assets can be building, can be laptops, can be servers, can be information. And we are also then dealing with third parties who then sit outside the organization on that left-hand side. So those sort of then three bits become an important component that if we want to be able to successfully deliver products and services, then those processes, assets, third parties, there should not be any disruption. They should be running smoothly. To manage those processes and assets, then we need to consider the constraints and vulnerabilities in those processes and assets, because each process then will have a constraint. So if your online banking system, or let's say your call center, you only have so many people that you can handle 250 calls at any given point in time, then that becomes a constraint you need to manage. So if something was to happen which breaches that constraint, then that's where the quality of your process will go down. Similarly, vulnerabilities is where if you have an online banking system and it's exposed to the outside world, then of course it's also vulnerable to cyber attack, because even cyber criminals will then try and get access to your systems. So from the day-to-day perspective, they're not necessarily thinking about risk. They're thinking about, okay, what could breach those constraints, and what are the vulnerabilities which may be exploited, which may result in my processes not operating as designed, or my assets not operating as expected. And then there are many operational projects which may be running. There may be various operational decisions which may be taken in terms of outsourcing, entering into relationship with third parties, and so on. And there are many internal stakeholders then who have to make sure that all of this is working perfectly. And there may be some business policies which are provided to the employees in terms of working and guidance on what is expected of them on the different topics. And then the last element here on the left-hand side is the law and regulation. So while a business is doing all of this, we also then need to stay in compliance with laws and regulations. And if you see here, there is no mention of risk in this case. Yeah, so this is just the core of what every organization will have some element of each of these components. And this is what the first line, when they come into work every day, this is what they come to work for. Yeah, that they're all working then either in a particular process, selling a particular product, running a particular project, making certain decisions, dealing with the third parties. This is what the first line is doing. But what is the second line want the first line to do? So this is then the risk management aspects, where from a risk management perspective, second line wants them to, first line to manage the risks, manage the controls, the policies, the actions, the indicators, incidents. So this is what then the second line is focused on. But second line can only define the framework around these topics. Second line cannot manage risk. Second line cannot manage those controls. So everything which needs to be done on this topic needs to be done in the first line. Yeah, so this is what then we need to do, that we need to now integrate the management of risk in all of those first line topics, so that whoever is then managing the process, risk management is part of process management and not a separate activity. And this is the big disconnect we see in a lot of organizations, where the second line is just focusing on these aspects, and second line does not appreciate what the first line is trying to do. And then of course the first line is trying to focus on what they do, and they don't then pay a lot of attention to the risk and risk assessment. They try and do as little as possible just to sort of get the compliance tick in the box, or just to get second line off their back, and then they get on with doing what they need to do from the day-to-day perspective. Yeah. And this is the disconnect we saw in the market, that most of the organizations have bought risk management tools or GRC tools, and this is what risk management tools and software provide. There are very few risk management tools which actually cover the first line component of what the first line is trying to do. And this is why it becomes very difficult for the first line, that they would not log into the risk management software to do their risk assessment, to report the incident, because when they log into the risk management software, there is nothing of what they're doing on the day-to-day basis in the risk management software. It's just repository of risk, repository of controls and issues and incidents, and that's not their daily job. Their daily job is managing processes, managing assets, managing projects. And this is where, when we saw this gap, that there was no software in the market which was created from a first line perspective, that most of the software in the market is created from the second line perspective. And that's why then you create this disconnect. So that's where we had to go and create a solution. So what I'm going to show is just show you an example of what does that integration mean in terms of integrating risk management as part of process management. But I wanted to give you a context around that software. So let me just log into the software here. So if I just show you an example of process, that if somebody now was a process owner and they were managing a particular process, so I can go to the process. And in this case, if let's say I was in the marketing team, I have a process here called execute marketing campaigns on social media platform. So that would be one process in the marketing team, where they are releasing ads on Instagram and LinkedIn and so on. So if I look at that particular process, then all the process descriptions will be detailed here in terms of the day-to-day execution. So this is what the first line is doing, that they are going and executing this process of deciding, okay, what ads do we want to put on Instagram? How much would we be willing to pay? Who do we want to target on Instagram? So they're executing all that process. And what we want is, we want risks then to be part of that process, that I should not have to go into a different system to now see the risks related to this process. I want the process and risk to be all in one place. And similarly, when I'm doing my assets, I want asset and risks to be in one place. If I'm doing projects, then I want project and project risks to be in one place. Because if they are in separate places, then we're just making it very difficult for the first line users that if they have to manage multiple systems, then they don't get that complete picture. So in this case, for that particular process, so we're still looking at the execute marketing campaign, what we can do is we can define these risk-related measures. So in this case, we've defined 8 standard measures, which will be relevant for all the processes you have in the organization. So we're saying that, okay, what is the likelihood that this process may deliver unexpected outcomes? Yeah, so if we are releasing a ad that, we may end up releasing a wrong ad on Instagram, or we may end up releasing a misleading ad on Instagram. So what is the likelihood of that? And then we get them to provide that input. And then, we can provide a little bit more guidance on what is very low and high and medium and low. But we are creating this risk-related measure. So now we don't have to go and define individual risk. I'm just now integrating the thinking about the risk as part of running that process. Then the second one is likelihood of inefficiencies. So is it possible that this process could become inefficient, where it could become slow, or it could not deliver as many outputs as we need at certain point in time? So what is the likelihood of that based on how this process is running at the moment? Similarly, you have a process disruption. So what is the likelihood based on how this process is running that it could get disrupted? So if it is a very manual process, or if it is relying on some 20-year, 25-year-old IT system where it keeps breaking, then that's where you would say that, okay, the likelihood of this process getting disrupted is high. And if that process gets disrupted, then what is the likelihood that we will not be able to quickly recover? So then you define that particular measure. Then you say, okay, what is the likelihood that some theft or fraud or misconduct may happen with the people who are involved in that process, or people who are interacting with that process? So that's where then that becomes another measure where you can then capture, a scale to say whether this process is more prone to theft, fraud, or misconduct. Then you can cover the compliance angle to say that what is the likelihood that we may end up breaching certain regulatory obligation if this process is not executed correctly. Then I have a measure on concentration risk exposure to say that, okay, do we have any concentration risk where in this case, we are saying that 80% of our ad spend right now is with Facebook. So there is a concentration risk in terms of this process with Facebook, that's where we're spending majority of of our advertising money with Facebook. So that's why the concentration risk here on this process has been ranked high. And then the last measure is the inadequate understanding of process by performers. So is there a good understanding? Because if a lot of new people are joining in all the time, then it is possible that the people who are actually executing the process may not have a complete understanding of that process. So then I've defined another measure here to capture that. Yeah, and that's what you can do then for all your processes. So if you have 600 processes in your organization, the process owner then just needs to think about these 8 measures to get an idea of which of those processes now have high risk exposure around these areas, and which processes have lower risk exposure around those areas. And then you can evaluate and match those. And then what you can do is you don't have to then map risks to those processes. Because every process will have, let's say, a risk of process failure. If you have 600 processes, you don't want to create 600 risks related to the process failure for this process 1, process failure for process 2, process failure for process 3, because then your risk register will just get massive. So in this case, we can actually manage the risks without defining the risks related to those processes, because now you think of, which measures do we want the process owners to think about in the process of managing from the day-to-day basis. And then what they can do is to manage those risks, they can then go and create controls directly on that process. So in this case, the controls are not mapped to the risks, because now these controls are very specific to this particular business process. So in this case, a control we have is that we have an approval of all the social media ads before they are released on the social media platform. Similarly, if there's click fraud, then we have a review process we do with Facebook to make sure that we're not losing a lot of money on click fraud on Facebook. Similarly, we do advertising with LinkedIn. So we have a process, where we interact with LinkedIn, that these controls are now just part of that business process. And then I've now taken away all that bits around thinking about risk, or what is the likelihood of this risk, what is the financial impact, reputational impact, customer impact. That of course, yeah, we need to do that, but I don't need to do that from a day-to-day basis. From the day-to-day basis, I'm managing this process, and I need something simple, which also then allows me to manage the risks associated with that particular process. And these are, and this is sort of an example of what we are proposing, because these now measures will be relevant for all the risks. And this is what then you can do for products, and you can do for assets, you can do for third parties, where you define those measures related to those things the first line is managing. So they don't have to then worry about creating a long list of risks related to their process, because they would just not see a lot of value in doing that. Yeah, but they'll definitely see value in thinking about the controls, because now they want to make sure that this process is effective. They want to make sure this process is running. So they will definitely see a lot of value in saying, oh yeah, maybe I should have this control, or I should have that control to make sure my process continues to operate effectively. Yeah. And once you have that, then you can, from a risk management perspective, or even from the first line perspective, you can have like a process resilience dashboard, where across all of those measures, then you can get a good idea of where those processes are. So if you want to then see, okay, which of the business processes are more prone to theft, fraud, and misconduct, then I can drill down and I can see that particular process. Yeah, because the process owners are now updating those measures, and I didn't have to do any likelihood impact assessment or any of that for just managing my process. So that sort of is one recommendation of embedding the thinking about the risk, because we want them to think about the risk. The assessment sort of is one part, that's the measuring part, so that is also important, but they will not be assessing on a day-to-day basis. On the day-to-day basis, they're running the process, and we want the thinking of the risks to be part of running that day-to-day process. Another example is around the objectives. So if I look at the business objective, and in this case, one of the business objective for this business unit is to increase new customer acquisition by 12%. So in the first line, now I am doing something every day in my business to achieve this objective, because if I don't achieve this objective, I will not get my bonus and my salary increase at the end of the year. So that's what I am focusing on the day-to-day basis. So while I am doing that, if I can also then get an idea of, okay, what are the risks I need to manage so that I can be successful in achieving this objective, then that's where you're able to see all the risks associated with just that one business objective. Yeah, so you're not looking at your entire risk register of your business unit. So now you can see that, okay, if I manage these risks successfully, then I will increase the likelihood of achieving that particular business objective. So I can see a direct connection between what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis and the risk thinking as part of that, rather than doing my day-to-day thing and then doing risk management as a separate thing. Okay, so let me just pause there and see if there are any questions okay, so Nirmala, the question, so I'm assuming your question was on process. So let me just go back to that. And if I open that particular process, so question is, are the assessments from each first line staff aggregated? Well, in this case, it'll be the process owner. So this execute marketing campaign, I have the coordination owner, I have the people who are performing. So those are the people who are running that process. So those are the people who will then be updating those measures. So they are the ones now updating this, because they are the ones closest to the process. Susie is saying, is this the RCSA process? Absolutely not. This is not the RCSA process. This is just, I am managing this process. I'm responsible for executing this process every day. So as part of that process, I am also now thinking about the risks because I want to make sure that my process continues to be operational and functional. By doing this, don't you walk away from good described risk and the clear drivers? Oh, absolutely, yeah. You need to do that, but you will not be able to do that necessarily for every business process, because that's where most organizations have hundreds and thousands of process. If you were to describe a granular risk for each of your business process, you'll end up with a massive risk library. So yes, you want to still think about the risk, but they will probably be more like a collection of process level and not necessarily at the individual process level. But what we need to do is that from the day-to-day perspective, this is what the first line is doing. And if they're not thinking about the risk in that day-to-day management, then we've created a separation between the day-to-day management and risk management. Because if you go and ask this process owner saying, oh, can you actually now go and describe all the risks related to this process? They're not going to be very happy because there may be so many risks they may have to think of, and then they just won't have time. So what is a better way, for us to get them to still think about the risks from the day-to-day perspective? And then of course, yeah, the broader analysis still needs to happen, but they will not be looking at 20, 30 risks on the day-to-day basis. So that's why these measures we have defined, they are there then to at least make them aware, saying, okay, think about theft, fraud, and misconduct as part of your process. Think about non-compliance as part of your process. Think about concentration risk as part of the process. And then we're giving them something simple from the day-to-day perspective, so that if there is a process where the concentration risk is low and it changes to high, then we can quickly find out, okay, where has that happened? And they don't have to go and do a very detailed risk assessment to capture that. It's just a part of that process. Does this measures put actions on them or just for them to analyze? So not sure, Stefan. Yeah, so that's where you'll need to give guidance. Okay, if that's what you mean, that yeah, if it is high, then yeah, in this case, then they will need to provide those explanation. And if are they doing something for that? So do they have controls in place? Or if there are any actions, then you can click on the actions and see, okay, are they doing anything to address? And if this action is blank, then you know that, okay, something is wrong. And that's where second line can then step in to say that, okay, you've said the concentration of concentration risk is high in this process, but I don't see any controls for that. I don't see any actions for that. So that's where the challenger function, sort of can come into play. But yeah, ideally, if they're managing that process, because the sole job of the people who are running this process is they will do everything possible to make sure this process is operating and functioning at the best quality as possible. So we're just embedding thinking about the risks and the awareness of the risk as part of that day-to-day process. And then will the system then ensure that it'll be read if they have not done this? Yeah, I mean, that you can definitely define all of those rules if you want to sort of escalate that if they have a high risk and there are no actions, then flag those processes. So you can create those sort of escalation reports if you needed that. Yeah. So this is where what the process library would look like. So if I just go to process resilience, so across all the different processes, then you will be able to see, okay, which processes then sort of more prone to non-compliance risk, or which processes are more prone to theft, fraud, or misconduct related risk. And all they're doing is they're just capturing those measures as part of their day-to-day process. We're not asking them to do inherent risk assessment, residual risk assessment, financial impact, regulatory impact, reputational impact. We are reducing the amount of effort they need to just think about the risk. We just want them to be a little bit more risk aware than they are at the moment when they are running that day-to-day process. Okay, so that's the idea that, because we did not see any software solution was doing this, that we all the best practices in ISO 31000, COSO, they all talk about this, but none of the software in the market was doing this. And when we were giving advice to the customers saying, oh yeah, you should integrate your risk management in your day-to-day process, they were like, okay, but how? Because all the risk management tool we have, they just allowing me to create a library of risk and library of control. They're not allowing me to or my first line users to manage their project. It's not allowing them to manage their process. And when we saw that, yeah, none of the vendors were addressing that, then, in order to create a solution, because otherwise we were just giving advice and we were not able to solve this problem for the customers, is where we created this solution, where the solution is for the first line, that we want the first line to do whatever they do on the day-to-day basis, and we want them to think about risk management as part of that rather than a separate activity. Yeah. So that sort of is where the solution comes into play. So I've shared an example of process and objectives, but of course what we've done is we've embedded the risk in all of those elements. So whoever is now managing a third-party relationship with IBM, they can now just measure the risks and the controls and the actions needed to manage the risks related to that IBM relationship. Similarly, if somebody's managing a project, then they can just manage the risks related to the project in the same place, where the project details are also highlighted. So you don't have this separation that I go into one system to manage my process and I go into another system to manage the risks. They need to be together, because if they're not together, then I will always focus on my process first and my risk second. So that sort of was our first practice. Then the next one is around integrating assessment of risk in decision-making process. Yeah. So if you don't do anything of what we're covering in this 3 days, if you stop everything you're doing in risk management and just do this one thing, it will significantly improve the quality of risk management in your organization. Yeah, just integrating the assessment of risk in how decisions are being made in your organization. So let me share a few details about this. So every business decision which you're making, which may be about moving your system from in-house to a cloud platform, or outsourcing an in-house process to an outsourcing process, launching a product, every business decision which first line is making can either bring new operational risk into your risk register or risk profile, or it can change the exposure of the existing operational risk. And that's why it is very important that as part of the decision making, risks are considered. The risk should not just be considered when we do our quarterly RCSA or when we do our yearly RCSA. So why is decision making important? Because the current state of however your organization is a result of all the decisions which were made in the past 12 months, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and how those decisions turned out. So if you want to be in a better state in the future, then it is very important that you think about, okay, what are the decisions we're making today? Because depending on how those decisions turn out in 3 months, 6 months, 3 years time, we may end up in a very different state than where we want to be as a business. So the quality of the decision becomes a really important factor in the overall performance of the organization. So we're not just talking about risk management, but just the general of where an organization, whether it will be successful and to what extent it will be successful. So that's where decision making is one of those differentiators between a successful and not so successful organization. So in terms of decision-making, what are the parts of a particular decision? So whenever we're making a decision, there is always something we want when the decision is implemented. So that's what I'm calling as desired outcomes. So there can be two types of desired outcomes, that as part of making the decision, you may want to create value for your organization or for your customers. So in this case, an example may be that you want to upgrade your technology so that you are able to launch your new product faster in the future. Because if you don't do that upgrade and spend $3 million, your product launch is very slow at the moment. So that may be the outcome you want from a particular business decision. Or the outcome may be to minimize system downtime, that maybe we have to buy an extra server to make sure our system has enough capacity so that it can reduce the downtime. And now we have to make the decision saying, okay, do we invest another 200,000 pounds in that server? But in that case, the objective will be to protect value and not to create value. Yeah. So those are the two possible desired outcome of any decision any organization is making anywhere, whether it's a strategic decision or an operational decision. Then every decision requires some investment. So that's what I'm calling as planned input. So it may be either a capital investment of, investing 15 million to build a new data center, or it could be just day-to-day operational cost, like paying the hosting cost of your cloud platform, or it could also be intangible, so the amount of management time which is needed to make that decision and execute and implement that decision is also then a important input you want to consider. And the third dimension is risks, because when you're making a decision, you're saying that, okay, this is what I want in the next 1 month. This is what I want in the next 6 months. This is what I want in the next 3 years. Those outcomes are going to only happen in the future. And anything which will happen in the future then is inherently exposed to risks. So then if anytime we're thinking about the future, we have to think about the risk, because otherwise we will be incomplete in our analysis of whatever we're trying to do. So in context of risk, there are two types of risk then you may have to think about. So there are inherent risks. So if you are providing access to your online banking system on the internet, then of course your cyber criminals can also get access to that. So theft of customer data from online system, because you've exposed your system on the internet, is just inherent part. And there's not a lot you can say that, okay, I don't want to be exposed to that risk, because the only way is then, you have to plug your online banking system, and then your customers are not happy. So that's an example of an inherent risk, where because of the business activity you're doing, you don't have a choice. You have to accept that risk and then just manage that to the most effective way as possible. But there are some risks which are optional, where you can decide whether you want your organization to be exposed to that risk. So you can decide, if you were making an outsourcing decision, whether you want the risk of disruption to your process due to your third-party failures. Because if that risk is high, then you may want to execute the process in-house rather than giving it to your third party. Yeah. So generally, when organizations are making business decision, they typically consider the desired outcome and the planned inputs. So that's what is, you would have heard of this term, return on investment. So that's where the return is the desired outcome and the investment is those planned input. But most organizations do a very poor job of actually also thinking about the risks when they're making the decision, and particularly operational risks. So yes, when they're launching new product, they may think of the credit risk, they may think of the market risk, but operational risk generally gets a very, very low priority in those sort of business decisions. And that's what we need to change if we want to improve the quality of risk management in the organization. Because if you do not consider the risk, then there is a likelihood that you will not be able to achieve your desired outcome. Or if you don't look at your risk, then it is possible that you may have to spend a lot more on implementing that decision than what you initially wanted, because you have to then put a lot of controls and things in place in order to manage certain risks. So if you know about the risks while you are making the decision, you will be able to do a much better return on investment decision, rather than doing it just based on the desired outcome and the planned input and very little consideration of risk. So that sort of is the challenge then now for the second line team, the heads of ops risk, the chief risk officer, is how do we now embed the thinking about the risk in all the key business decisions which are being made by the first line, because that's where either new risks are being taken, or that's where the exposure to risk may be changing so significantly that if they don't do that, then as an organization, we will always be weak in terms of our risk management effectiveness. And that sort of is what is called as a high quality decision. So if you're making those risk informed decisions, then those would be classified as high quality decisions. And if they're made without consideration of risk, then they should be classified as low quality decision. And what you want to do is you want to then go and identify where all of these decisions are being made, because there are some strategic decisions, there may be some decisions at the execution layer, and then there are lots of decisions which are being taken at the operational level. Yeah, and any decision which is then about a certain amount. So let's say any decision about $1 million, you can say that, okay, that's an important decision. So anybody in the organization who's making a decision about more than $1 million or $5 million has to go through some sort of business case or has to go to some committee in order to present a case. That it's unlikely, especially in financial services organization, that one person will just be able to say, okay, let's go and spend that 5 million. There'll be a lot of due diligence for that level of investment in most organizations. So if so most organizations already have that decision-making process in place. So what we need to do is we need to identify that, okay, how do those how do those people who need investment are presenting their business case? So is it an Excel template where they have to provide details about the return on investment? Is there a PowerPoint template? Is it a Word template? That we identify in what format do they create the business case before they present it to their committee. And then we need to go and embed operational risk management related topics in that template. And then we have to make sure that the person then who needs money to launch that new product, they consider the operational risks related to that new product. And the committee, which is then making the decision, they also then need to make sure that they only provide approval to business cases where adequate consideration has been given to operational risk. Because if they've only thought about credit risk and market risk and very little about operational risk, then the committee should say no. You go and do your analysis and then come back to us, and then we'll make the decision. So we need change on that two side. That we need to change the template, whichever template they have to use to populate all the data about why they want that investment and how it would benefit the organization. We need to embed operational risk management topics in that template. And then we need to train our committee members or whoever is approving those decisions that please do not approve anything if you do not see enough details around whether the person who's presenting the business case has thought about the changes to the operational risk. Yeah, so let me just pause there before I drill down to see if there's anything on the chat. Okay, so there's nothing on the chat at the moment, but yeah, if there are questions, then please enter there, and then I'll keep looking. All right, so that's the decision-making process. And then what are the 3 steps? Because now if we recognize that, okay, yeah, this is important, we don't want people to make cloud decision, outsourcing decisions, launching new products without adequately considering operational risk. So then we need to help the first line on, okay, how do you incorporate now thinking of risk? Because we can't just say, oh, you have to think about risk. Second line now needs to give them some tools, some thought process, some method on how they can think about those risks as part of their process. So in terms of process, there are 3 things which happen as part of every decision. So the first phase is where you are actually making the decision. The second phase is where once the decision has been made, you implement. And then once the decision is implemented, then you get your post-decision operations, or whatever is the outcome of that decision, then that becomes your day-to-day operational element or your BAU element. So if you take an example of making decision to migrate a core banking system, which we currently have in-house, and the bank is deciding whether, okay, we should we migrate this to the cloud platform. So that would be a big decision. So there'll be a lot of deliberation and thinking around, okay, how much it's going to cost? Is it worth it? So there's a lot of discussion which would happen at that stage. Once the decision is made saying, okay, yeah, it makes sense, let's go and do it, then a project would be set up to sort of do that migration, and that may last 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, depending on how big that core banking system is. And then, of course, yeah, we need to manage the risks related to that change management project, but it's still related to that decision. And then once the system is migrated to the cloud, then of course we will be then exposed to all the operational risks associated with hosting systems and data on the cloud. So then your operational risk profile will change after the system is completely migrated, that you will then need to also assess and analyze the risks associated with your cloud operation. Yeah, so that's where risk needs to be considered as part of all 3. You don't want them to migrate to the cloud and then think about the change in the operational risk profile after the migration has been completed. Yeah. So this is where then, as part of the making decision, a key element is considering the different alternatives. So let me show you then. This is an example of how we have incorporated this, because this is also a very important first line activity, and there is no risk management tool right now which provides a process, a structured process to make business decisions, because that's a first line activity. So they don't cover first line activities. They just give you risks and controls and incidents and issues. So in this case, because this is a very important first line activities, we had to build functionality to support that decision making. So in this case, if I open this decision of upgrading the system, and in this case, if I go to the alternatives, so as part of this decision-making process, what you're thinking is, okay, what are the different drivers we need to consider? So in this case, the driver is that we could do a cloud installation of our core banking system, or we could keep it in-house, or we could just outsource the whole thing to a vendor. And then, we don't care whether they have it in-house or on the cloud. We just pay them a fixed fee, and then they will just run the core banking system. Then I have a choice of, okay, which vendor do I go to? Do I go and upgrade to the FIS system, the Oracle system, or SAP system? And in this example, the bank is using the SAP core banking system at the moment. And then do we do the upgrade in multiple phases? So do we do the credit card customers first, and the current account customers next, and mortgages next, or do we do all it in one phase? Because of course, if you do it all in one phase, there'll be a lot more risks you'll need to think about then if you do the migration in phases. So you identify the different drivers of that decision which are important for you to consider, and then you create the different alternatives. So in this case, we are saying that this alternative is that we will stay with SAP, but we will migrate to the cloud. That right now we have the SAP system in-house, but we want to take advantage of all this new cloud technology, because the security may be better than the security we have in-house. So in this case, we've created an alternative, and I've called this as a conservative alternative, because when you're considering your decisions, you want to look at your conservative alternatives, which means those are the very risk-averse type of alternatives, but you may want to also consider some ultra-radical option. And as part of decision-making, you should use that opportunity to think outside the box and see, okay, can we do anything different this time? And that's where I've created an ultra-radical option where we will just outsource the whole thing to a vendor. So we don't have to worry about maintaining and managing that core banking system at all. And if I open one of the decisions or one of the alternatives, in this case, there are 4 alternatives I have created, and now I have to pick one of those alternatives. And each alternative now will have a different likelihood of success, because in terms of successfully completing that migration on time, on budget, which of those options have a better likelihood of success. Each alternative will have a different level of investment required. So you can see, that what is the range of investments we need to think about. And then each of those alternatives will be exposed to very different risks. So if I stay in-house, my risk profile is going to be very different. If I go on the cloud, my risk profile is going to be very different. If I outsource the whole thing to the vendor, my risk profile is going to be very different, the nature of operational risk. So with each alternative, then you're thinking about the desired outcome, you're thinking about the investments, and you're thinking about the risk. And if I open the conservative option 2, so this is where you will be able to see the level of investments. So in this case, you can then see whether the cost of cloud hosting will be 5 to 6 million over the next 5 years. The cost of implementing and maintaining the software will be 12 to 15 million. The cost of the software license will be 32 to 36 million. So they've identified the different investments in context of that alternative, and they've identified the operational risks we would be taking if we go with that alternative. So this is where now we've integrated thinking about the risk as part of the decision-making process. And it's happening in the same place where you're making the decision. You don't have to then close your decision and log into the risk management tool and then try and think about the risk in a separate tool, because then you've created that separation. And then first line will never do that. If they have to log into a separate risk management tool to think about the risks, they will not do that. So this is sort of an example of how you then allow. So we've taken all the best practices from decision science and decision analysis and created that structured process, so that if you follow this process, then you're following the best practices, and as part of that, you also have as part of that, your risk management thinking, is also integrated, and then it gives you a repository of all the big decisions which are being made in different parts of the organization. So then everybody has visibility on what are those significant decisions we are currently making or we have made in the last 6 months, and how are they turning out? Are they turning out to be how we expected in terms of the operational risk profile, or are they turning out to be very different? So as an organization, then you have this repository of all your important decisions, so you can then learn from those decisions. So if you made an outsourcing decision 2 years ago, and then we learned some lessons, next time when I'm making my outsourcing decision, I want to learn from the failures and the weaknesses we had from that previous decision. So by having that repository of decision, you then create an organizational memory, so that the person who makes the decision goes away. I still have all the thinking is still in the organization. The thinking has not gone away with that person. So that sort of is what this element talks about, then integrating risk as part of that decision-making process. And this is what then you will get, that once you have then collected all the data, you will have different alternatives. In this case, we had 3 alternatives. And then whoever is making the decision, whether it's a committee or a board or a senior management team, they will now look at each alternative, and they will look at the desired outcomes. They will look at the plan input. They will look at the risk. And now, depending on the risk appetite of the organization, depending on whether they believe the data which has been collected is correct, they will then go and pick one of the alternatives, and that's where the decision is made. Okay, once you pick a particular alternative. And in this case, the last point I've highlighted here is that, from an SMCR perspective, at least in UK, this is where senior executives now have, there is more a requirement for senior executives to demonstrate how did they make a certain decision. So to need to have evidence that did they consider the operational risks when they were making that decision. And if we're not thinking about capturing these decisions in a structured way, then it'll become very difficult, especially when something goes wrong and the regulator then wants asked that question saying, okay, show us that you considered your operational risk as part of this outsourcing decision 3 years ago. And then you'll have to go and find those Excel files and PowerPoint files, and it won't look that great. So that's where to improve the quality. So this just improves the quality of how you run the business. And then if you incorporate risk in that, then it just improves it better. So just making or thinking about these decisions in a structured way can go a very long way in both organization performance, but also effectiveness of risk management. And then, you will implement the decision. So this is where then you'll have your change management program, that once you've decided that, okay, let's go, we'll stick with SAP, but let's go on the cloud, the SAP cloud, then there will be an 8-month change management project, and then risks need to be managed as part of that change management project. So again, operational risks need to be considered as part of that change management project. And then once the project is completed and our core banking system now is on the cloud, then we need to update our operational risk register, so that now we need to assess and manage the controls related to all those cloud specific risks in our risk register, which we did not have when our system was in-house. So that's where this decision has changed the profile of your operational risk. So those are sort of the elements, and all of this is coming from decision science, decision analysis, which is a 50-year discipline. So this is not something I've just invented. It's been there for 50 years. If you Google on decision analysis and decision science, or if you search for that on YouTube, there are hundreds and thousands of videos. So there's a lot of information on how you make better business decisions. And what we need to do is, as part of helping our organization make better business decision, we also want to then integrate that they also think about operational risk when they're making those decisions. So operational risk management is not an afterthought. So let me check if there's any questions here. Okay. Okay, yeah. So Nirmala is asking, yeah, with this concept, there needs to be close collaboration and coordination between the second line, credit risk, market risk, op risk, so that, yeah, there is no confusion. Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, yeah, the business is making the decision. So if a product manager is saying, oh, I want to launch this new mortgage product, then the product manager will have to create the business case, and then they will need to then make sure that whichever committee then is approving, that committee then makes sure that the credit risk of that new mortgage is considered, the market risk, the operational risk is considered. But absolutely, yeah, because if they are making those decisions and they haven't talked to the credit risk team before they go to the new product approval committee, then yeah, the new product approval committee should just reject that business case. So that's why it's very important, that template, because if the decision makers know that in order to get approval for my decision, I need to capture all this information and operational risk is part of that, then they will automatically then come and talk to the right people, whether they are, yeah, the people who are managing operational risk in the first line, or they may come to the second line to get help on that. But you want that onus to be on the people who are going to submit that application for getting new budget for whatever they want to do. And then by adding the operational risk element in that template is where you're then making it as part of business as usual. You don't want to just leave them on, oh, please think about risk. No, now it's in that template. So if there is like 10 sections in the Word document where they have to create the business case, and if section 7 is operational risk, they know that they can't go and submit that to the committee unless they've filled that section adequately, because they know they will get challenged if they don't have adequate information in that section. So that's where we just want it to be embedded. It's just part of that process. So we're not relying on, you know, the nice thinking and the proactiveness of that person. It's just something you have to do. Otherwise, you can't go to the committee. The committee will just reject your business case. So that sort of is the decision-making element. Then the next practice is develop and utilize different risk assessment approaches. Yeah. So this is where a lot of organizations just create one approach for assessing their operational risk. But in real life, what the first line is trying to do is a lot of things. You know, so they may be trying to do something very quickly. They may only have 30 minutes to make a decision, and they want to then think about the risk in those 30 minutes. In some cases, I may have 6 months to make a decision, and then I can be a little bit more rigorous if I have 6 months to make the decision. But if I have 30 minutes to make the decision, I'm not going to go and do an inherent risk analysis and control effectiveness and residual risk. But I simply won't use that approach. So what we need to do is, if we want first line to consider operational risk, we need to give them different approaches. We need to give them a menu of approaches so that they can pick the right assessment approach depending on what their business situation is. If they have 30 minutes to do something, then we need to give them something which is quick. If they have 1 week to do something, then we can give them a little bit more rigorous. If they have 6 months to do something, we can give them something a little bit more rigorous. So there needs to be a menu of risk assessment approaches available, and not just one way, and this is the only way, because then it will work in some cases, but it will most likely not work in most cases. And here's an example that if you have a operational risk in your risk register called unplanned outages to the online banking system due to technical failures, then that risk may need to be considered when you're starting a 6-month-long IT project where some new functionality will get added to the online banking system. So whoever is now making those changes, that project team will need to consider that as a result of whatever change we do, we don't want to cause unplanned outages of our online banking system. Then during approval of a significant new product launch, which can significantly increase the volume of the information in the system. So if somebody's launching a product, and if that product was successful, then it will bring so many customers that our online banking system will not be able to handle that extra volume. Then as part of that new product launch, they need to think about that one operational risk. When a product manager is considering potential new ideas for new products that may be launched in the next 12 to 18 months. So in this case, this is still very early days. They don't know what product, they're just brainstorming. And as part of that brainstorming process, we want them to think about that particular risk, so they don't come up with some idea which will increase the likelihood or the impacts of that particular risk. As part of considering a decision to migrate the system from in-house infrastructure to the cloud platform in the next 3 to 5 years. So that's another place where that operational risk is going to be affected. So whoever is making the decision, we want them to think about that one risk. As part of making decision to outsource the system to a third party. So if you're thinking of outsourcing this online banking system to a third party, then we need to consider that risk as part of that decision. And if there is a significant vulnerability which is reported in the media, in the vendor software utilized for the system, then also we want to go and think about that particular risk. So there are lots of business situation in different parts of the business where when they're trying to do something, and all of these are first line activity, that none of this is risk management related. So this is what the first line is trying to do on the day-to-day basis. And we want them to think about that unplanned outage risk as part of those things. But if we don't give them a choice of different risk assessment approaches, then they will not look at that risk. Yeah. So let me then show an example of what this looks like, because this is another sort of a flaw we've seen in a lot of current existing risk management systems, where there's just one approach and then everybody has to use just that one approach for assessing their risk. So if I open this risk of theft of customer data by cyber criminals, which is one of the operational risks you would have on your risk register, what we have given is we have given menu. So in this case, there are 6 different choices which have been given, and there is sort of an explanation of those. But if I show you the approach which we saw in the first session around impact analysis, which is a little bit more rigorous. So if I open that, then this is what we had, this is the approach that we had seen yesterday, where you do your event analysis of your data breach. So in this case, we're saying there's a very high likelihood of that event happening because of the number of phishing emails we're getting every day, number of unauthorized access attempts our IT systems are being targeted with every day. So in this case, I'm saying the likelihood is high, and then I'm giving a percentage to justify that. And if we don't manage this risk, so if our preventative controls are not effective and we do have an actual breach which happens, then here are the 3 impacts we will need to then think about. And in this case, paying compensation to the customer would be one of the impacts. So if I open that particular impact, then I can go and capture the same analysis which we saw yesterday on the PowerPoint slide. So I have that minor, moderate, major, and catastrophic, where I am now capturing, saying, okay, if this data breach happens, then 41 to 99% likelihood that we'll have to pay between 10,000 and 100,000. And then I'm providing those justification to explain, okay, what is my understanding of that minor scenario. And then moderate, I have my amounts. Major, I have my amounts. Catastrophic, I have my amounts. Yeah. So this is the approach we saw yesterday, but this approach will not be relevant in all the cases. So if there is a product manager, for example, who needs to, he's thinking about the product, he hasn't even come up with any ideas on what that product would be, if it is still very early days, but he knows that, okay, it'll be related to mortgages, or it'll be related to some new credit card they're thinking of. Then what you want to do is you want to give them something really simple. So the most simple risk assessment approach is where you just do a very low, high, medium, because then in that case, we don't want them to necessarily think a lot about the likelihood and customer compensation, because it's still early days. They still haven't even finalized what product they're going to launch, but they still want to think about the risk. So as part of their product thinking, they want to identify that, okay, if we go and launch this product, then here are the 6 or 7 operational risks we need to think about. And right now we think if we launch this product, then this would be the exposure. So you're giving them something very quick. Yeah. So that sort of is one approach, because they're not going to go and do that, the minor, major, catastrophic for that simple case. Then you can give them, if they want a little bit more, so if they want to capture the likelihood and impact, which is what happens on most of the IT projects, where from an IT project perspective, we're capturing the likelihood and the impact. So in this case, we say, okay, you give your likelihood and impact, and then those can be multiplied, you get a number. It's sort of, yeah, not scientific, but at least it gives you a way to prioritize, because the important bit is we want them to think about the risks. And if we don't give them these easy approaches to assess the risk, and there's only one way where they have to do inherent and likelihood and impact and residual, they are not going to even think about the risk as part of that. Yeah, so that's what I mean by giving them different approaches. So depending on what their business situation is, if it is something quick and dirty they need to do, where we're not still launching the product, but yeah, when they're thinking about the product launch and it's the approval is going to the committee, then yeah, you want them to be a little bit more rigorous. But in the initial days, where they're still brainstorming, but if they still are thinking about the risk, then we have to give them something simple. So that's what sort of we mean by the menu of assessment options. So we are thinking about, yeah, the first line. It's not about, yeah, the assessment approaches. It's about getting them to think about the risk and how can we make it easy for them to do that. Let me just check on the chat if there is. Okay, so there's nothing on chat. Great. Okay, sorry. Okay. Okay, so this is where I want to be. So the next practice then we're looking at is defining the principles for escalating and prioritizing risks. Yeah. So in most organizations, they use risk heat map to decide, okay, what are we going to escalate to the board and the senior management? What are we going to prioritize, or what are our important risks? Then risk heat map is what is used. And then anything on the red is what, then gets all the time and attention. Anything on amber then is, gets the second priority, and anything is green, yeah, no discussion happens on those. And that's a very reactive way of prioritizing risk, because if you are only thinking about risk when they become amber and red, then you are reactive. We want to think about managing the risks so that they stay at the level where we want and they don't go outside the accepted level of risk exposure. So a lot of times there may be a lot of green risk which you may want to escalate, and not necessarily in addition to, yeah, what you are escalating on the red or the amber side of your risk heat map. So the idea here is to think about, okay, what else we can use? What are the set of principles we can use to prioritize or escalate, so that if we have 200 risks in a risk register and I need to present 10 risks to my board, how would I pick which 10 risks do I put into my board report? And you can't just have risk heat map as a way to do that, because that's one of the things about risk assessment, right? The risk assessment, the whole exercise of risk assessment is to prioritize, but I shouldn't have to go through that process. There are still a lot of ways in which I can prioritize risk without necessarily capturing the likelihood and the financial impact and the reputational impact. So to do this is where we need to think about this concept of risk radar. So this is where we say that there are two levels of escalation in any organization. So there are some risks which we have to escalate at the board level, and there are some risks which need to be escalated then just at the business unit level, but they're not still significant enough that a board would be interested in those risks. And then on the top side is where the risks would be risks which either require some remediation actions where the control environment may be very ineffective, and then we need attention from the board or from the business unit to get more budget to invest in the controls around those risks. Or the risk exposure may be okay, but maybe there is a lot changing on that risk. So we just want those risks on the radar of the board from a monitoring perspective. We're not expecting them to do anything, but we just want them to be aware, because something about that risk is changing so quickly that we don't want the board to be surprised and they say, oh, why didn't you include that in the last risk committee report, for example. Okay, so from an escalation perspective, those are the two dimensions then you want to think about. And then I've just created that intersection of sort of your Act 1 will then contain all the risks which now need board attention. And for all of those risks, you need money to change your controls or buy an insurance policy. So there is some investment, some actions are needed around those particular risks. Monitor 1 is the risks then which are relevant for the board, but no problem at the moment, but they should be aware of that. And similarly, Act 2 is things at the business unit level where it requires budget approval and so on from the business unit. And Monitor 2 is where it's relevant for monitoring from the BU level, but not necessarily at the board level. And then you can define the different principles. So I wanted to give you a starting point of what those principles can be. But of course, yeah, you will need to customize this, for your organization. So in terms of deciding what goes in Act 1, then this is where we can say key risks that require board level approval for implementing appropriate remediation actions and where the current risk exposure is misaligned with the risk appetite. So this is where, yeah, if something has breached the risk appetite or may soon breach risk appetite, and now we need to change or implement some actions which require board level approval, then I would include those risks in that segment of the radar. Then any risks which have open critical audit findings should be included in that part. Any risks which have any critical regulatory findings should be included. And then any risks where there are critical or open operational risk issues associated with them would be included. And any risks where significant operational risk incidents have happened in the last 12 months. So those are some of the principles you can use to decide which risks do you include that in that Act 1 part of your board report. And then what you want to do is you want to focus on the risks. So that's where I've given some additional criteria, that risks that can potentially derail the group business strategy, because those are the risks that the board would be very keen to hear, that are there any risks where if they were to materialize in the next 6 to 12 months, it can derail the strategy we're trying to execute at the group level. Then risks that can significantly affect the likelihood of achieving any key business objectives. So if market share or getting new customers is an important objective, then are there any risks related to those business objectives? Risks that can affect likelihood of successfully implementing significant group business or technology projects. So if there are any big change management programs going on, are there any risks that need to be included? And again, those risks then only if they fall into that categories we listed above, only then you will include in Act 1. Risks that can cause significant level of reputational harm for the firm, and risks that can cause significant level of regulatory fines. So you will look at which risks sort of fall into that bucket and then further filter those risks by those criteria on the top to decide, okay, these are the risks then which will go in the Act 1 part of the board report. Then in the Monitor 1 is where you can put key risks, which are still within the risk appetite, but maybe there is too much changing about that risk. So risks associated with Brexit, for example, would be one example, or risks associated with COVID-19, would be another example where we may be within risk appetite right now, but there is enough changing around that risk that we want that to be on the radar of our board. We don't want them to completely not think about those risks. So you can use that principle. Then key risks where significant incidents have been reported within other firms in the past 3 to 6 months. So if there is a significant money laundering incident reported in Westpac, then you may want to sort of flag that so the board is aware that, okay, something has happened in the industry around that risk, and they can then ask questions to ensure that that particular risk has been managed effectively within the organization, but they at least have that visibility on what is happening within the industry. Then key risks with a high level of risk velocity. So if there's a risk which is changing very quickly, so COVID-19, for example, would be one of those where things are changing quickly, then you would sort of flag those as part of monitoring 1, even though they may be all within appetite and your existing controls, everything is working perfectly fine, but you would still include that in the Monitor 1 part. And if there are any key risks where the indicators have become amber or red, because then if those indicators are defined correctly, they're giving you that early warning sign. So then the board would want to know about those risks where if the indicators are red or amber. And then the same set of risks you would look at, because that's what the board would be interested in, those sort of criteria of risks. So that's Monitor 1. Then you have Act 2. So now we are coming down sort of at the business unit level. So if we were sort of Barclays, and within Barclays, you'll have the retail banking. So now what is the retail banking senior management team? What would they be interested in? So in this case, they will be interested in risks which are outside appetite at the BU level, but they still, sort of not important enough for the group level. So, but if they're important, then yeah, they may go in both the board report and the BU report, if it's a major breach of the appetite. Key risks with all the BU open audit findings, BU regulatory findings, BU operational risk issues, and any incidents which have happened in the business unit level in the last 6 to 12 months. And then sort of, similar set of criteria where, then you, in case of the Barclays example, they will be then only focusing on any risks related with the retail banking business unit strategy. So are there any risks which we need to consider, any objectives around the retail banking business unit, and then any change management programs which are running within that business unit, which they need to be aware of from a risk perspective. And then, of course, any risks which can have reputational or regulatory harm. And then the last one is monitor 2. So that's where you're going to include key risks that are currently aligned, but things are changing very quickly. Significant incidents have happened in the last 3 to 6 months. And then, the risk velocity point we talked about, and key risks with amber or red monitoring indicators. But in this case, you will just look at the risks related to that one business unit for which the escalation or the report is being produced. Okay. So those are the example of criteria, because in this case, in terms of risk assessment, maybe only that first bullet point, talks about risk assessment, but that's not the only way you have to escalate risk. Maybe the risks may be green, but because we are proactive, you want the risks to be managed while they are green. You don't want to wait for those risks to become from green to amber and amber to red, and only then you escalate and only then you do something about it. So from this prioritization perspective, let me also then just demonstrate. So again, I didn't want to just talk about theoretical ideas. We want to make sure that there is a practical way you can see of how that is done. So if I go same to the theft of customer data by cyber criminal risk. So in this case, what we have done is we've created a risk radar. So this is where now the risk owner can decide where does he want, whether he wants to flag this given risk on the radar of the board or on the radar of the BU. So the options we've given is that this risk needs remediation action and there is an escalation to the board required, or it needs remediation action, but we don't need to escalate it to the board. We can manage it at the business unit level. Or there will be risks where you need to actively monitor and we will escalate it to the board. Or you have risks which need to be actively monitored, but at the BU level, they will not get escalated to the board. And then a lot of your risks, which are then not that important, you don't want to worry about, then they will be marked as do not include on the radar. So then they, the board and the BU senior management team, they don't get that noise, because what we want to do is we want to sort of separate that noise, because if you have hundreds of risks and thousands of controls, it becomes very difficult to decide, okay, what do we present to the senior management at the business unit level? What do we present at the board level? And that's the challenge we wanted to solve without necessarily doing a risk assessment, because of course, risk assessment is one input you will use to decide, but that's not the only input. So once you do that for all the risk, and this is where we let then the risk owner decide whether they want that risk needs to be flagged. And then of course, second line and third line will challenge them if they think something should not be on the radar, and second line says, no, but that has to be on the radar. Then that's where that discussion needs to happen in terms of that challenge. But at least you will be able to easily see, okay, what have they currently flagged on the radar and what is under the radar at the moment. And once you have that, then you should be able to easily visualize that. So a view we provided was something like this, where you can then pick a particular business unit. So if I just want to see at the retail banking level, then this is the view. So from the retail banking level, I can see that, okay, what are the risks right now we've escalated to the board level and where they require remediation action. So in this case, disruption to customer process due to the pandemic event is on the board radar. and theft of customer data by cyber criminals. And I can see that in both of these cases, yeah, these risks are outside appetite. And plus, I have some justification of why we had to escalate this to the board. But more importantly, I'm able to see the business objectives connected to that, because that's what the board will always be interested in. And right now, I've seen a lot of risk report where we talk about the risk, but we don't talk about, so what does that mean for our business? Because we are running this business to achieve our strategy, to achieve our objective. So this then is that important element of linking risk and business together. So I can then click on the objective and I say, okay, if we are not good at managing that risk, then which objectives we are at the risk of not achieving by the end of this year. So I always have that connection between any risk on the radar, and I can see why is that important for our business. And then on the right-hand side is where you have the board risks, which are then only for monitoring purposes. And then of course, those will also go into the board reporting, but then the business unit can also see, okay, what are we managing now at the BU level? So here are some of the risks where we're doing at the BU level, but they're not significant enough for us to escalate to the board yet. And then on the right-hand side, you have then risks we are just keeping an eye on, where things are within appetite. There's not too much to worry about, but we want to make sure that we keep thinking about this and we're monitoring this, because things can change and we don't want to be caught by surprise. So it gives that element. So that's the idea of creating this risk radar, so that risk heat map is not the only way in which you prioritize risk. There are lots of other ways and lots of proactive ways in which you should be thinking about prioritizing and escalating risks. So that's that particular practice. I just checked on chat. There were no questions there, so I will continue. Practice 9 is really simple, that if you're doing inherent risk assessment, then stop doing it if it is possible. If there are fans of inherent, if the head of operational risk is a fan of inherent risk assessment, then you don't have a lot of choice. But if it is possible for you to get rid of that, then you should get rid of that, because we're already struggling with our first line to do the residual risk assessment. And now if you want the first line to also do inherent risk assessment, you've just doubled the burden on the first line, because now they have to think about 2 sets of things when they're doing their risk assessment, and it's already a struggle to get them to do residual risk assessment. So why create that extra burden of capturing inherent risk assessment? And it doesn't provide any business benefits. So there's very little business benefit, because you're not going to do anything with all those inherent risk assessment responses you are collecting. All your risk escalation, risk reporting is based on residual risk assessment. So the only place where inherent risk assessment is important is when you want to create a business case. So you want to say that, okay, we need to invest another $5 million on improving our cyber risk related controls. Then it makes sense to show that, okay, right now our risk exposure is 350 million pounds if there was a worst data breach. So by investing 5 million, we will be able to reduce that maximum impact. Then it makes sense to do inherent risk analysis, but it should be part of that business case. It should not just be part of the standard RCSA process organizations implement, because it just creates a lot of noise. There is very little value, and you want to remove things which don't add value for the first line as part of the process. So do it when it's needed, but it should not be part of the standard process. So let me see if there's any questions here. What is the different regulations about removing inherent value? I don't think there is any sort of mandatory regulatory guidelines, because if there were, a lot of organizations would be in trouble, because a lot of inherent risk assessments are actually not correct. So I haven't seen, I mean, the regulators say that, you should think about it, but I haven't seen sort of a mandatory requirement that, you have to do. If you don't do inherent risk assessment as part of your RCSA, you are non-compliant. Then there's another comment here. So removing inherent risk assessment might have a bigger impact if the risk itself is too big a risk. What to do in this scenario? So in that scenario, very easy solution for that, Sridhar. So let us show you how we have addressed that. So if I just go to the risk, then the way we have addressed that is for each risk, we have allowed the option to create a priority, this one. So you can then easily identify which are the most important risks. And then of course the risks where the inherent risk exposure is really high would sort of, you can flag them as very high, and then risks with low exposure you can flag them as low. So you can do that, but you don't have to do inherent likelihood, inherent financial impact, inherent reputational impact, because all that it's just first line. They will not be able to think about a world without controls, and it just doesn't add any value. And there's not a lot of reporting we do on that, because everybody is then interested in what is the residual risk exposure. So if you want to use that for prioritization, then create some sort of a priority, and then you just do it once. You don't have to do it as part of every RCSA, because your inherent risk is not going to change in every RCSA. It's going to remain static unless your business has completely changed from the last assessment. So that's what I would recommend, that you can still sort of prioritize your risk by creating a value, and then all those risks with potentially large inherent risk exposure, you just flag them based on these levels here. So let me check. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so then let's go back. Okay, so I was on the inherent AI. I don't have a lot to say here. I am, as you can see, I'm not a fan of, because I come from the first line. So that's why I'm saying this from the first line perspective, that it may be great, and it'll be really nice if first line had a lot of time and you had the buy-in, but I think there are many other challenges we need to solve before first line will be able to do a good quality inherent risk assessment. So until we get to that maturity, let's take it out and let's just focus on the residual risk exposure, because that is what we want people to focus on and manage with the controls and their day-to-day process. Okay, then the next practice, practice 10, is utilize even number of scales for control assessment and providing clear guidance. So far we've talked about risk assessment. So I wanted to touch on control assessment, particularly on this particular point, where if you have 3 scales. So let's say when you do your control assessment, you ask your people, okay, is this control effective? And then the responses are effective, not effective, partially effective, and not effective, or red, amber, green. Then what that process suffers, it suffers with a human bias, that it's vulnerable to a human bias. So this is again going about and thinking about this human aspect of risk management. So the human aspect is that whenever we have odd number of choices and we are uncertain, we always go for the middle ground. So if I have to pick between red, amber, green for my control, or effective, partially effective, and not effective, then by default most people will go for the middle ground. And there is also sort of an incentive reason, because they may say that, okay, if I say effective and I'm not really sure, but if something goes wrong, then the second line team will be on my case saying, oh, but you said this control was effective, so how did it fail 2 weeks after you did that assessment? So that will be in the back of their mind, but they also will not want to mark it not effective, because if they say the control is not effective, then the second line will be on the case and saying, oh, what are you doing? What are you doing to improve this control? So it's just that human element is then, if you're doing that, one of the things you will see is that 60 to 70% of your controls then will be marked in that middle area. And that just then doesn't give you any good quality information, because now you don't know whether it's in the middle area, because is it really in that middle area, or is it suffering from that human bias, or is it suffering from that intent where they're just trying to game the control assessment process? So an easy way to address at least a human bias element is to create 4 levels, because then I have removed that middle ground. So now they have to think about that if I am in the middle, then I have to think that from a design perspective, do I have minor gaps or I have significant gaps? From a control implementation perspective, do I have minor deficiencies or significant deficiencies? Yeah, so that they won't be able to just go with the random middle in this case. Yeah. So this is very, if you have odd number of scales, then a good practice is also always to have even numbers in your scale. So you don't have that middle ground. And then giving them as much guidance as possible so that when they're assessing, let's say in this case, the design of the control, then what are the criteria they need to consider? So in this case, we're saying only assess the control design as fully adequate if the control design fits the purpose in changing the likelihood or the impact of the risk. If the control design is aligned with external standards and best practices, if the control is designed by experts with more than 5 years of knowledge of operating similar control, and if all the vulnerabilities and constraints and assumptions of that control are fully documented and have been considered in the design of the control, only then you should mark that control as fully adequate from a design perspective. So you're giving very clear guideline, because otherwise if you don't give a clear guideline, then of course they're going to try and do whatever is best for them, and whatever can keep the second line away and keep them away from the risk committee, they will just go with that approach rather than trying to give a correct picture as part of the control assessment. And similarly, you can then, on the control implementation or control execution, you can give a scale that you can only say a control is fully effective if the control is operating as per the design. There is evidence of the control operation, and that evidence is available. There are no open issues or weaknesses we know about at the moment. There has been no incident in the last 12 months which resulted from the failure of that control. The control performer has adequate skills and resources to operate the control. Any indicators you have in relation to that control is effective for the last 6 months. And there has been no exception on this control where people were able to bypass that control, because if there are exceptions, then there is something not right with how the control has been implemented. So only then you can mark the control as effective. So again, we're just giving as clear guidance as possible so that there is no ambiguity, and we can improve the quality of information we're collecting from control assessments. Then the next one is considering the human factors of risk and control assessment. So we've touched on this sort of as we have went along, but I wanted to also highlight this as a separate element because it's really important that, we don't want to treat risk assessment, control assessment as a mechanical exercise, because at the end of the day, the people who are doing that are going to define the quality of the information we collect and what do we do with that information. So in this context, there are some of the factors I wanted to highlight, which you want to think about, but this is where I would recommend read the book, Think Fast and Slow, which I had highlighted on the first day, that has lots of examples of how humans have this bias and tendencies where we may do things which may not be right in certain circumstances, or we may think is right, but it may not be correct, and because of our human biases we may have. So please, do read that book, Think Fast and Slow. That the whole book talks about just this one topic. So from an operational risk perspective, the one we want to talk about is the experience and perceptions of individuals who are doing the risk assessment. So are the people who are doing risk assessment, are they very risk averse people, or are they risk taking people? Because depending on their risk attitude, their responses will reflect their risk attitude. So we need to then adjust the information we are getting from their assessment depending on the individual risk attitude. Then you have perceived rewards or punishment. So we talked about this, that if I mark a control as not effective, will the second line now call me every Friday and ask me about what am I doing with this control? Because then that will be perceived as a punishment, and then they may not mark that control as not effective. They will just mark that as partially effective so that they can keep second line off their bag. And similarly, if there is a reward, so if a head of the business unit thinks he can get a higher budget if he overestimates certain risks for their business unit, then they may overestimate the likelihood and the impact of the risk so that they can get a bigger budget from the board. So you need to look at whether that gaming is happening of your risk assessment depending on who is providing those responses. Then there's an element of groupthink where you have, this typically happens when you get into a risk assessment and you are assessing, let's say, 10 risks, and there's not a lot of critical thinking, which happens. The first person says, oh yeah, I think this is high, and then everybody agrees, and then nobody challenges. Then that's an example of groupthink, where you're just trying to get through the motion. You're not really thinking about the risk in a critical way. Then the next one is, as humans, yeah, we always overestimate risks which have happened recently and underestimate risks which have not happened in the recent past. And COVID is a great example, because before COVID-19, if you went and looked at the pandemic risk, it was sitting right at the bottom, and nobody was worrying and bothering about it. And then as soon as COVID happened, it's jumped up on everybody's risk register. So that's a great example where because it's recent, everybody now is overestimating the potential impact of COVID-19. And then similarly, if there are other risks which have not happened for a long time, and those are on your risk register, you may want to consider the factor that maybe the people who are doing those risk assessment, they are underestimating the likelihood and the impact, and you may want to validate the assumptions or the data they are using to come up with their assessment. Similarly, if we are over-relying on just one or two experts, so if the assessments are only done by just one person and he didn't talk to anybody in that business unit, then we know it's going to be a very poor quality assessment. So the over-reliance becomes that element where we want, as part of the risk assessment, some discussion to happen. And in a lot of ways, that discussion is a lot more important than what they provide as the value of the likelihood and impact. So if there is that discussion happening and there is an evidence of that discussion, then that should give a little bit comfort that, okay, yeah, they are serious about managing that risk, and they are thinking, because that is what matters, not the output they will capture in the likelihood and impact. Then you have another one, which is the anchoring bias, which you will see that if you are in a risk workshop and you're thinking, oh, well, how much compensation we may have to pay to the customer if this risk happens, and then everybody looks at each other and nobody has any answer. And if the first person comes and says, oh, I think Barclays paid £3 million when that risk happened at that, then immediately everybody in the room will get anchored on that 3 million. So whatever is the first number which gets put, then the whole discussion, and then you'll see that the final assessment will be around that number. Well, in reality, the actual impact may be 10 million or 15 million. And that's where whoever is facilitating those workshops, they need to be aware, because the people who are doing that assessment, they will not know that they're getting affected by anchoring bias. And that's why in these workshops, it becomes very important to have an external facilitator, so that they can keep people honest and make people aware, saying, oh, your group is now suffering with groupthink, or you're suffering from this anchoring bias now. Another one is the Turkey effect, which is Nassim Taleb sort of talked in his book, where you would see this on many IT projects, for example, that if it's a 12-month project and you ask about, oh, what is the risk status of that project? Oh, everything is green. And February, everything is green. And March, April, May, September, October, even October, everything was green. November, everything was green. And December, everything goes red from green. Yeah. So that's called the Turkey effect, where we just get so comfortable, or because everything is green, nobody worries about anything, and then we don't challenge. And then when sort of things start coming to the deadline, then instead of going from green to amber to red, we just go, everything becomes red in the last 2 weeks of the project. And that's called the Turkey effect. So if everything is green, then it's not a good thing. Something is wrong. You need to go and challenge, because there is no organization where all the risks will be green and all the controls will be green. That's an unrealistic organization. So that sort of is something to be aware of. If you see a report where everything is green, it's not correct. Something is wrong with that particular business unit. Then you have assuming humans are rational, in all situations. So that's where, you can have the same person in one workshop. He may come and say one thing, and about the same thing in another workshop, they may say something else. And you just expect that. And various studies and so on has proven that humans, are not necessarily rational in all situations. So we should not assume, that they will be rational. So we need to be just ready to deal with the irrationalities. Assuming the future will be same as the past. And so this is another common one in risk assessment where, we take the assessment we did last year and then we just try and tweak a little bit. We take copy and paste 100 risk assessments we did from last year, and we say, okay, let's change this one to a little bit here. We change 3 or 4 risk assessments, and then if we say, oh, we're done for this year, and then you just assume that everything has stayed the same, which in some cases may be okay, but you want to be aware that that may not always be the case, especially if you're working in things like money laundering, or you're working in fraud where things are changing very quickly, and particularly in cyber, where the cyber risks we have today are very different to the cyber risks we had 5 years ago, both in terms of the nature and the severity. And if you're running any workshops, then that's where you want to make sure those workshops are not more than 3 hours, because that's where the effectiveness of those workshops will drop if they're more than 3 hours. Let me check. There was a question. Person who does accurate assessment without any biases. Okay, so I'll read out this question. So can incentivizing a person who does accurate assessment without any biases will eliminate human factor bias? Ask for narrative on what that rating, etc. And if assessment by multiple people, it should be individual assessments, not an assessment workshop outcome. So incentivizing correct assessment without any biases. So I think so. My answer would be that biases, they're operating at the subconscious level, because a lot of time the people who are suffering from those biases, even they don't know. So it requires somebody else to look at them and saying, hey, now you're suffering from the anchoring bias, and then they become conscious about it. So I think biases may be difficult, but gaming. If people are trying to game the system, then that's sort of where you want to be careful to see whether they are overestimating the risks, because that will allow them to get a bigger budget next year, or they are underestimating because they don't want to go in front of the risk committee and they don't want the second line team to bother them too much. So that's where you want to maybe separate that bias and the gaming aspect a little bit. Okay, and then in this case, the one point I want to highlight is this book. So yesterday there was some discussion on that. Even when we were using Monte Carlo, for example, there was question on, oh, but we're still providing a subjective input, and how do we know this is better quality or not better quality? Agreed. So that's a very valid point, and that's where you need to read the How to Measure Anything book, because there is a process you need to go through. It's called calibration. So whoever is doing the risk assessment, we need to make sure those people are calibrated. And it's, I'm not talking about changing anything in their minds. So it's a simple exercise, but we need to make them aware of what their biases are. And that's where in this book, we don't have time to sort of go through that detailed exercise. But that book talks about a lot of examples. And if you follow through that, and if you do those exercises before you go into a risk assessment workshop, you will see that the quality of your risk assessment will significantly improve. Yeah, so it's called a calibration technique of your subject matter experts. And that's where, we don't have time to go through that. So that's why I wanted to highlight that, but it's really, really important that at least the people who do our risk assessments, they need to be calibrated. Otherwise, we will have poor quality assessment outcomes. So because of shortage of time, I'm going to sort of skip this part. So I'll just jump straight to practice 12, which is the last practice, where you want to make sure that when you're doing your risk assessment, or when the first line is doing the risk assessment, it's not just based on internal information. So if I was doing a risk assessment of online banking fraud risk at Barclays, yes, I will look at how my controls are working. I will look at any incidents. I will look at my KRIs to do my assessment. But I need to also look at what's happening outside Barclays on online banking fraud, because maybe there is something else happening in other financial services firm or within the industry, which may inform my risk assessments. And this is one sort of weakness I've seen, that in a lot of time, the risk assessments are just based on internal information and no external information. And in that case, then your risk assessments would most likely be incomplete or partial, because now you've not factored in. Maybe, you know, the likelihood of something happening is higher because of some information which is available, or some trend which is being reported, and the people who are then doing that assessment internally, they're not aware of that trend, and then they think, oh, it's not happening here, so it won't happen here in the next 12 months. Then that's where the quality of the risk assessments will be weaker. Yeah. So in this case, there is enough information available publicly now on operational risk. So whether it's ransomware, whether it's pandemic, whether it's money laundering, that on a lot of operational risk, there's a lot of information available outside on the internet. But what the challenge there is that the first line, when they're doing the risk assessment, they don't have time to go and Google and find out, oh, what's happening on online banking fraud risk, because, you know, they hardly have time to finish their assessment based on the internal information. They don't have time, you know, to then go and Google what's happening on money laundering, what's happening on ransomware risk. And that's where we need to give the first line users who are doing the risk assessment some tool where they can easily look at that external information in a structured way. And that's where, when we saw that, this was a critical issue which is affecting the quality of the risk assessments organization are doing, then 5 years ago, we started building a solution for that. So we said that, okay, if Google, it's difficult on Google to see information by operational risk, we will go and take that information and try and structure it into operational risk. And that's where I want to quickly just show you what we have done on that. And then I'll give you a little bit more information. So if I go in as a user, so this is a operational risk horizon scanning service which we provide, which gives you a view. So I'll use this in context of risk assessment. So if I was, let's say, going to Risk Spotlight category, and I'm just doing assessment of online banking fraud risk, then I just need to come on online banking fraud and click on that. And then I will get all the news articles of what is happening in the world on the online banking fraud risk. So now I don't have to go to Google, that we have done that research of organizing all the relevant information and structured it by the risk you are assessing. Similarly, if somebody is assessing ATM fraud risk, then they can click on the ATM fraud risk, and then they will quickly see, okay, what's happening, what have been some of the recent loss events on that particular risk, and what are some of the emerging topics around that particular risk. Yeah. And this is where, for loss event, there is a lot of content providers, you know, like ORX and BBA and SAS and IBM. But risk assessment, we are looking at future, right? We're trying to say, okay, what could happen on this risk in the next 12 months or the next 24 months? And that's where you need forward-looking information. And there are no content providers in the market who provide that forward-looking information. So that was sort of our primary focus, to provide information relevant for operational risks, which are forward-looking, so that the people who are managing that risk in the first line, they can easily get access to that information and incorporate that in their day-to-day work, because they will just not have time to go to Google and try and find that information. They would definitely need a better way. Yeah. So this sort of is where the portal comes into picture. And right now, from what we know, there is no content provider which provides forward-looking content. So yes, there are a lot of content provider where you can get all the loss events for the last 20 years for ATM fraud or money laundering, but there is no provider at the moment who provides forward-looking information. Yeah. So you can utilize this. And then another element where it'll help in the risk assessment is where we do the deep dives. So for example, if I show you a deep dive, we had done of, let's say, the Danske Bank. Okay, so let me just filter on the Danske Bank money laundering scandal. Okay, so here was a update we did, where on a monthly basis, we analyze sort of any significant topic, and our customers, our subscribers, you know, sort of pick those topics. So in April 2019, they picked Danske Bank. So what we do is, as part of that, we then analyze that loss event in as much detail as possible. So we said that, okay, what happened in context of that event? And now what were the different impacts? And this is financial, reputational, business impact, people going to jail, court cases, that we then arrange that in a timely manner, in sort of a timeline, so that you can easily see how the different impacts of that incident has evolved. And then you get ideas of all of these different numbers, which can be very helpful then when you're doing your risk assessment, to say that, okay, if in this case, investors are seeking $475 million in damages because they think the management did not tell them about the money laundering weaknesses. So they went and bought all the shares and now they've lost all that. So there was a legal case for 475 million. So analysis like this can then give you that information you need to do your risk assessment. Otherwise, your risk owners have no idea that, okay, what is a realistic amount of compensation we may have to pay? What is a realistic amount of regulatory fine we may have to pay? So by looking at information like this, at least they get a starting point, and then they can, sort of tweak that to the internal organizational context, and then utilize that information for doing the assessment. And then this is where we had highlighted then what are the lessons we can learn from that incident, which can then also be very important to make sure that, if we want to avoid this happening in our organization, then let's go and fix all of these issues if they also exist in our organization. Yeah, so that's an example of what we provide as part of the RiskSpotlight portal offering, which is the tool you want to use. So the reason I'm using it in context of risk assessment is because if risk assessment is not considering that external element, your risk assessments are incomplete. Yeah, so whether you use RiskSpotlight portal or whether you use external content, use something. Something has to be used, because if you don't, then the quality of the risk assessment is not good. And then that's where I just wanted to highlight in case anybody interested in the portal, then here's sort of the subscription. So we tried and make it as affordable as possible, so you don't have to go and get like a big business case. So if there's like a one user subscription, you can get that for $9.90 for a year, and you get access to all that information. And I know some of the participants are already paid customers of that, but some of you, if you have not already considered, then there is a free trial available for 2 months from that link. So if you want to look at that content and see if it will be relevant for your organization, and if it can help you, improve the monitoring and assessment of your operational risk, then please do consider subscribing. There was a question, so let me pick. Okay, yeah, so there's a comment on very informative platform. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So that sort of is that external element. So then that summarizes sort of, brings us to the close in terms of practices. So we've covered sort of 12 practices in total. So I'll just quickly now highlight. So we just have that as a closing comment. And then I have a couple of slides to talk about the next workshop, and then we'll close this series. So let's quickly go through the 12 practices we've talked about. So the first one was around defining risks at the right level of granularity, ensuring that risks are described consistently. It's not a mishmash of risks and causes and impacts, and always link risks to business objectives if you want buy-in from the first line. Then defining appropriate measures to assess the risk. So think about which measure you are using, because whichever measure you pick, then there are pros and cons associated with that. So you want to pick the right measures to assess those risks. Then we talked about using Monte Carlo simulations. But use that from a first line perspective. We don't want our first line people to suddenly start doing capital modeling and economic capital and all that. We just want to use Monte Carlo in context of validating whether that subjective assessments we have done, how close Monte Carlo is saying we are, and just use it to challenge the quality of the risk assessment outcomes. Then we talked about integrating management of risk in the core business activity. So process management is what somebody should do, and managed risk is part of that. And process management and risk management should not be different. We should try and put risk management under the process management bucket. Integrate assessment of risk in decision-making process. So if you don't do any of what I have talked about, if you just do this one thing, this has the potential to significantly change not only the quality of the performance of your organization, but also the quality of risk management in the organization. So if you wanted my favorite, this would be my favorite one, number 6. That just identify where those big decisions are being made and integrate thinking about risk in those templates and process. Then develop and utilize different risk assessment approaches so that, we give some easy options when, they want to do a quick analysis and they don't have a lot of time. But then, also give them the rigorous techniques where we want them to be rigorous. So give them the choice. Defining the principles for escalating and prioritizing risk. So that's where, you may want to escalate, prioritize without doing a risk assessment. So we talked about those principles. Removing the inherent risk, so if possible, but of course, in a lot of organizations, there are some heads of operational risk who are absolutely passionate about inherent risk and will never accept that suggestion. But that is fine. But if that's not the case in your organization, and if there is a possibility, then consider dropping it. Utilize even number of scales for control assessment measures and provide clear guidance on those scales, so we can then make sure they're not impacted by the human bias of going for the middle ground. Consider the human factors of risk and control assessment. So there are 2 books there where Think Fast, Think Slow, and How to Measure Anything. That those 2 books have all the ideas you need to consider and improve the quality of your risk assessment by addressing the people aspect of the assessment process. And then the last one was, integrate emerging operational risk topic, because there's a lot changing on operational risk outside your organization. You don't want to be blindsided by things because the risk owners and the first line they were just focused so much on what's happening inside the organization. They completely ignored big things which were going on outside. And you want to pick on those things as early as possible so that you can do something about it when you have time. So that's the summary. So that's the end of this workshop, in terms of content. But of course, we want to continue this journey of learning. So the next workshop we plan to organize is on monitoring. So now that we have the assessment covered, we want to now focus on monitoring. That what are the things we could do to improve the monitoring of operational risk, both at the first line level, because at the end of the day, first line is managing the risk. That right now a lot of monitoring happens on the second line, but that's not as effective as monitoring on the first line. And that's where in this workshop we will then cover a little bit more on what are some of the current practices and what are the flaws of those, and then can we improve on those practices. So that's happening on 25th November from 1 to 4 p.m. So we'll just do it as one session. It's 3 hours because it's a big topic, but we want to sort of make sure we get to go into lots of examples and question and answers and so on. And it's again, a free workshop. And if you're interested in that, then you can go to the riskspotlight.com/training and register for that. And then if you are not already familiar, we do have a channel on YouTube called RiskSpotlight channel. So that's where we also have published lots of videos on topics like operational resilience, how to integrate operational risk management into core business activity. And we will also upload the video recordings of these sessions we have done on there. So we want that to be sort of a learning platform. And we try and do as many of these courses as free so that we can share those ideas with as many people as possible. So if you want to provide your first line or your second line team as a learning resource, then there's a lot of good videos which are available on that channel. And that's the end of the training. So let me see if there is anything on chat. Okay, so there's no questions at the moment. So let me then just say a big thank you. Or let me stop sharing and just start my video. so you can actually see me, see who has been talking for the last 3 days. So thank you very much for spending time. You've given 6 hours, and I fully appreciate how much valuable those 6 hours are. And hopefully, yeah, you found at least some ideas you can go back and implement. I know we did cover a lot of ground. But if there are any ideas where you want to follow up, or you want to see that, okay, Manoj, you talked about this, but how do I do it in my organization, or how do I apply it in my organization? Then feel free to reach out. I'm always there, ready to help in case anybody needs help on implementing any of these ideas which we talked about. Okay, so I'll stay here if anybody has any questions, but if you don't have questions, then yeah, you can sign out, and hopefully I'll see you in the monitoring session in November. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.